All right. Well, we are really lucky today to be joined by Kevin Donovan. So to give you a little bit of background on Kevin, Kevin works at the Toronto Star. So the Toronto Star is one of the major newspapers in Canada. Kevin has worked at the Toronto Star for over 30 years, and he is currently the chief investigative reporter at the Toronto Star. Now, Kevin has also won multiple awards for his work as an investigative reporter. The first thought I had when I was planning this was that I would actually rhyme off the awards. The problem with that approach is that the time in our podcast would disappear because the number of awards are almost countless. So let me try and then just simplify things and say Kevin is one of the top, if not the top, investigative reporters within Canada. Kevin has written several books. The one that we are here to talk about today, which is a terrific read, is the Billionaire Murders, which is the very tragic story of Honey and Barry Sherman. The book has spun into a podcast series and also a Crave series. I have read the book, listened to the podcast, and watched the Crave series. I've done all three of those, and I would highly recommend that people take a watch, a listen, and a read to each one of them, because you will learn something a little bit different about this very tragic story of Barry and Honey Sherman. And you will also learn the work that Kevin has done in trying to get to the bottom of this story, which the story is not over yet. The truth is still out there, and it's still not fully resolved yet. But again, you will gain an appreciation for the work that Kevin has done, which has spanned multiple years, frankly. Now, what I also realized going through all of this is I gained an appreciation of the work that an investigative reporter does when digging into a story, and it is very detailed. So, what I'm going to do, Kevin, I got a bit of a favor to ask of you, and I'm going to share a bit of I'm going to put this into a story to illustrate the point. But let's just say, now I don't know how you come across your stories. We're going to talk about this in a second. But let's just say it's a Sunday morning. You're sitting in your favorite chair on your deck, with your laptop in your lap and your coffee by your side. And again, it's a beautiful Sunday morning, and you are on the hunt for your next story. I'm not sure if that's how stories typically come to fruition. But let's just assume again that you're all sat in there on that Sunday morning looking for your next story, and then all of a sudden, my name flashes across your screen. Now, not that it ever would flash across your screen, but if it ever did flash across your screen, I would very much appreciate if you took a hard pass. I'm sure there's lots more interesting people to investigate than me, but it would be very much appreciated if you could take a hard pass on that, because what I've learned going through all of this, now I'm going to reverse the story here, because what I appreciate going through all this, or what I gain an appreciation for, is the level of detail. Because if I was sitting on my deck in my favorite chair with my laptop on my lap and a coffee beside me on a Sunday morning, and my cell phone rang, and I picked it up and I said, hello. And the next words that I heard were, hello, this is Kevin Donovan from the Toronto Star. I just have a few questions I would like to ask you, Scott. My response to that would probably be something along the lines of, thanks for the call, Kev. Hang up and I will call you back in a few minutes. I would then turn to my laptop and start Googling Canada and non-extradition countries, because I would be starting to get quite concerned. Now, Kevin, I do actually have a little bit of knowledge on Canada and non-extradition countries, because one of the past guests on the show was an individual by the name of Chris Mathers. Chris is ex of the RCMP and ex of the US DEA. And for any aspiring white-collar criminals out there, there's two major issues with Canada and non-extradition countries. Number one, the list of non-extradition countries is quite small, so it is not a long list of countries. And the second issue with non-extradition countries, as Chris Mathers told it to me, is I said, Chris, we talked about the first issue, what's the second issue? And Chris had said, well, Scott, you're going to run into a second problem if you're planning to escape to a non-extradition country. And I said to Chris, well, Chris, what is that problem? And he says, Scott, you're going to need something that you don't have. And I said, well, Chris, what are you talking about? He says, well, you need money and lots of it, because the second you run out of money, it is Russian gulag for you. And Kevin, I don't know if you can appreciate this or not on the screen, but I'm an accountant who spends their life working on a laptop. The over-under for me in a Russian gulag, it's certainly not years. It is probably not months. We're probably talking hours or days. So again, it would be very much appreciated of me and my family is that if in the low probability event that my name ever flashes across your screen, is to take a hard pass and to work on the next story.
But no guarantees. Is there a question coming?
There is a question coming, because what fascinated me before we get into the Barry and Honey situation is the role of an investigative reporter. And I would love for you to give some perspective of how does the proverbial story flash across your screen? Is it as I described? Are you sitting there on a Sunday morning and something, or is it more mysterious?
I can answer that.
Okay, go ahead.
But you got to let me speak.
Go ahead.
So I've been at the Toronto Star for 39 years. Stories come to me in a variety of different ways. I'm rarely sitting down looking for a story, because stories come to me by people calling me up, people emailing me, sending me a encrypted text message, and it usually follows this pattern. I've done a story, for example, the Sherman story, and people reach out to me saying, well, can you investigate this? And so at any time, there are dozens of stories that I think of sort of in a holding pattern where I'm doing a little digging into them to seeing if they're going to catch fire, if I can do a bit of spade work in the early days of something. It may not come to fruition for, say, a year. And the stories come from either known sources, people that I've known for years and have sort of grown up in, say, government or policing or some area like that at the same time that I've grown up in journalism. So it comes from known sources. It often comes just from people out of the blue who will just say, I saw your name and here's something you should look at. In the case of the Sherman one, it was an assignment from my boss. So 3 different ways.
So how do you pick a story that you think is going to have legs? Like so I can imagine, you have all these sources in, the Toronto Police and probably a whole bunch of other sources that span not only in Canada, but probably across the globe. How do you pick and choose which ones you're going to dig into?
Well, it has to be a story that ticks a couple of boxes. First, it has to be an investigation in the public interest. And Scott, what I mean by that is not that it is interesting to the public, but that by doing the story, I will put some scrutiny on some, say, government or agency like the police and try and move the ball forward a bit to make things in this particular area better for people in that area or ideally in a wider community. So it has to have a public interest to it. But it also has to be a story that has not been told before. It has to be something unique. Back in my early days of reporting, I would do stories that were probably just smaller stories, important nonetheless, but smaller. And these days, I'm looking for something that is, involves, a person who is, say, not being brought to justice. I'm working on a series right now of what I believe to be a miscarriage of justice. So it has to be something different and something impactful. I think the role of an investigative reporter is the most important part of the role is that you're trying to make a difference.
And would we be surprised on the number of stories that are out there? Like, do you get flooded with questions and comments every day? And it is a process? Because I can imagine too that there's a lot of maybe fictitious stories out there where people have a bone to pick or something like that. the process of trying to whittle those down, is that an intensive process to try and get those down to a short list and something that really has legs?
Yeah, it is. That's a good way to describe it. One of the analogies I use to describe being a reporter is you're like a firefighter, and the fire alarm goes off. The firefighter has to check to see if there's a fire, and most often there isn't. But if there is, they have to do something about the fire. And in my case, there are in the time that we're going to be on this call today, I'll probably get 2 or 3 tips that'll come in.
Wow.
And so I'll look at them. I'll respond to the person. I might ask for more information. If it's possible, I will direct them to somebody else at the Toronto Star. We've got a great batch of a group of interns this year, and we're always looking for stories. And but I do try and get back to everybody. Often people that are first time callers will want a call for them is 2 hours. So obviously I can't have 2-hour calls with 3 people a day, or I wouldn't get my current investigation done. So I'll kind of schedule those often when I'm on like if I'm driving somewhere to interview somebody somewhere outside of the GTA, and I'll just have a conversation with the person. I can tell, I would say, because of my years of experience, within the first 5 or 10 minutes, if it's going to be a story for me.
And what's the process then? Because the other thing that you appreciate when you read the books is that the stakes are high. Like, look, people, like, for me, I can be wrong in my job, and the consequences are minimal. You know what I mean? Worst case scenario, I get fired at my job. In your case, though, the stakes are through the stratosphere. If you're wrong, you're impacting people's lives. It is like the stakes are through the stratosphere. I'd love to just get a little bit of a peek behind the curtain on the process, which I can imagine is quite extensive, which actually involves investigating and trying to get to the facts of the story to make sure that you don't get it wrong, because the stakes in your job, again, are as high as anybody. Like it is, you can't be wrong, because once you push that button and those newspapers start printing and this hits the front cover of the story, you can't just go and erase it from people's memory. The stakes are as high as they can possibly be.
Well, yeah, I mean, but we're not, doing heart surgery. So just keep that in mind. There's a lot of people that have, very important roles out there. It's a life and death situation. For me, first of all, the first thing to do is typically a tip comes from a person, an individual. And so I want to talk to that person. I actually want to have at least a telephone call, if not a face-to-face chat with a person. And I ask them a lot of questions. And I tell them at the outset that, look, I've got a lot of different stories that I'm exploring. I am always working on something right now. So I say, I can't drop what I'm doing, but let's have a conversation. And then I try and get from the tipster, which is how I'll describe them for the sake of our conversation. That I'll say to the tipster, tell me the 2 or 3 things that you're concerned about, and let's see if I could prove those things. So let's just say I'll just use a small story as an example. Some years ago, I did an investigation into a senior executive at the Toronto Transit Commission who was allegedly providing contracts to a girlfriend. And this guy, the TTC person, was married, but he had a girlfriend he was having an affair with. And the allegation was that he was providing, I think it was about $80,000 or $100,000 contract for this girlfriend to do some photography. And that's a conflict of interest. And, there's a lot of things wrong with that. So the first thing I do with that tipster is get the names of the people. And then I look up to see, is there a TTC executive for this name? Internet is very helpful. We didn't used to have that when I started. Who's the individual? And then is there a contract? And there's a lot of, there's ways I can find out if a contract exists. But then, and this goes to your opening remarks about, the call from me on a Sunday morning. Over my career, I've learned that it's better to go to the target, or whether it be an individual or a government agency, quite soon, actually. I don't want to investigate in the dark. So after I ascertain that these people exist and there is a contract, although I still want to gather more information, I am going to call up that person, and I did in that case. And sometimes the person, and it's usually the innocent people, will say, "Whoa, that's not true. Let me explain to you the background of this and why it might look like I did something untoward." In the scenario I gave you, which is a story from years ago, the person didn't want to talk to me and got really angry. And I had a sense that maybe I was on to something. And then I went to the governing agency, in that case, the TTC. And that was a rare example where a senior person at an agency said, "Look, we're going to look into this right now, and we're going to give you an answer by the end of the day." And I think it's possible the person was fired before I even published the story. That's how quick it happened.
Wow.
So I'm a real believer in going to the other side early and often. That's really, really important. A lot of reporters worry that if they do that, they're somehow going to get scooped. The story's going to get away. Stories don't get away. If it's a story, it's going to be a story. So, and it's also the fair thing to do, because if you have a person who is being accused of something, I think they have a right to respond. And the other reason I do it is that if I were to spend, let's say, 3 months on this story and talking to people, it's going to get back to person X. They're going to know I'm coming. So It's also, I guess it's the element of surprise. I want to see what they will say about this allegation. I think it's the right thing to do. It's a fair thing to do.
The other thing that I find really interesting in what you do is the use of confidential informants, which we're going to talk about. In your situation, you had one. How do you deal with confidential informants? Like, to me, those confidential informants are taking a lot of risk by reaching out to you and kind of, sharing you the details and trusting you to make sure that you are not going to disclose their name. Maybe just talk about that relationship and how does a confidential informant first approach you? Like, you talk about encrypted text messages and things like that. Is that you talk about in your situation, you met with them in a coffee shop, which would seem like a pretty public situation, but how does that play out over time with the relationship you have with confidential informants?
Yeah. So first of all, it's wise not to just hand out the status of a confidential source like candy. You have to give some thought to, is there another way I can get this information? People typically do start the conversation by saying, I don't want to be named. I don't want to be in this story. And I'll say, okay, well, look, I'm just trying to gather information right now. The coffee shop sort of situation, which we described in the Billionaire Murders, did happen. It happens frequently. And, you have to choose certain coffee shops because you don't want to be in a situation where, people don't really know what I look like. But if you've seen, say, the documentary or any of my stories, you might know. So, and let's say the source is an important person in the city. So I do try and say to the person, why don't we choose a place where neither one of us have ever been to meet? But the other thing is, I say, we're going to talk about the sensitive information that you want to give me. And I said, and I do this to help the person. I said, make sure that I know if you're telling me something that only you know, that would out you as a source. And I also try and, if people are using a computer to send me information, I say, like, don't use your work computer. And I had a situation some years ago with a source who was a great source on a really important story, and the person turned out was sending me confidential information from a work computer, and the employer actually set up a camera and caught the person in the act. Actually, what they did, this is really awful. They were able to see the person's password to his or her Hotmail, and then check the Hotmail account, which is a breach of all sorts of things, and all sorts of privacy things. And privacy rules. And then they caught the person, they saw the emails sending me data from this government agency. And I've never been able to reveal that full story because the individual said, look, I got disciplined. I'm not going to do it again. And I don't want it to get to escalate. But so I will tell people things like that. Be careful with your computer, with your cell phone, meet in person if possible. Because people, whistleblowers are really important in society. But a first-time whistleblower, and most whistleblowers are first-time and one-off whistleblowers, don't know what it's like to deal with a journalist and might not know how to take precautions. So it's a conversation. And I find that when you have these conversations with people, which are preliminary to the actual meat of the allegation, it makes them more comfortable because they understand that I and the Toronto Star are taking this seriously.
And how do you determine what is fact and what is fiction? Like, obviously anything you write, especially as an investigative journalist, this isn't like a political article in the paper, which is an opinion piece. This is, I would guess, one of the most important parts of your job is being factually correct. They can criticize you all you want about whatever you may write, but if you're writing facts, you can't, how can you criticize facts? And I just wonder, from when you're digging into a story, how do you separate fact from fiction?
Well, that's the most important part of this, going to the other side and getting them to what I call plead guilty with an explanation. Like, yes, I did this thing, and here's why I did it. And you get them on the record admitting to stuff. That's the gold standard. Documents are key. In my TTC example, that the actual contract, and there was an actual contract that I got a hold of, is really helpful. Going to others, I don't like a confidential source to be the proof of the story. And if a confidential informant is going to be the proof, then I need to have three of them. Is the kind of the rule of thumb there. And there are times when you can't prove something. And I'll use an example, and this was before the Me Too stories, but I did an investigation with another journalist outside of the Star on Jean Ghomeshi, who was the top CBC radio host, and again, this was before Me Too, and he was a much beloved person, and there were women that were coming forward confidentially to say that he had to say the least very bad behavior with them, and so there was no proof of this behavior because they were just Mr. Ghomeshi and the source in a room, in a bedroom, but then I asked for things like text messages and stuff to kind of verify some parts of it. But then when you present the story as we did, you present it as allegations. We've gone multiple times to Mr. Ghomeshi in this case to get his responses. And if you can't prove something as fact, then you present it as allegations. And it's, the Rob Ford crack story, which I did as well, is a really good example of that. It wasn't until the video finally surfaced that we were proven right.
Yep.
And in the original story, I would say the word allegation was used at least 20 times because we couldn't prove. It was a video that we didn't have a copy of. We'd seen it. We believed other reporter, I believed it was Mayor Ford. I don't know if that's crack in the pipe. I'm told by sources it is crack in the pipe. So, and that's the thing. And I know there's a lot of distrust these days in the media. And actually, I think there's always been distrust in the media. But the reason you'll see a story with the word allegation as opposed to fact is that's the best we can do. And to not do the story would be a mistake.
So the other thing I just want to get your take on, you've been in the newspaper business for over 30 years. The newspaper, I love newspapers.
39, actually.
39 years. Wow. I get a newspaper delivered to my house every day. It's the Toronto Sun, which is one of the reasons why, again, you talk a lot about in the book about
But shouldn't you
headline.
get the Toronto Star?
Yeah, well, you know what, Kevin? After this, I'm subscribing to the I'm the a lot of what you talk about. We would certainly read, because the Toronto Sun versus the Toronto Star on the Barry and Honey situation again. It is fascinating to me the way that it played out. You mentioned Joe Warmington. I read Joe Warmington all the time. Almost every day he's writing an article in the newspaper. But I love the newspaper. We started this conversation on a Sunday morning. One of the favorite things I like to do Sunday morning, Kevin, is go outside, get my newspaper, my coffee, sit down, open up in front of me and read it. That's one of the things I like to do. And when I was reading your book.
And how much better will that experience be with the Toronto Star?
Exactly. I agree with you. I'm a converted subscriber now, Kevin. You got me. And when I was reading what you were writing, what came back to me was a very famous movie called Spotlight. And Spotlight is a story of the team at the Boston Globe who uncovered a lot of the wrongdoings of the Catholic Church in Boston. And when I was reading what you were writing, there's a lot of similarities there where, like you say, what a story in the public good, where you are writing to get to the bottom of what happened to Barry and Honey, and you reached a different conclusion than what had initially been reported on, and you were ultimately proven to be correct. But before we get to that, I'd love and I guess what I'm trying to say is the newspaper, that form of media, played a critical role in educating people on what actually happened. Now, the other thing with newspapers, which is, again, really disappointing for me as a big newspaper fan, is that the newspaper industry has had some very tough times over the last, 15 years or so, or 10 years, whatever it may be. Again, I used to subscribe to Sports Illustrated all the time. Again, I like to read something hard copy. Give us your take, Kevin, on the future of the newspaper industry, and where do you think newspapers are in 10 to 20 years? Because again, your story is a great example, frankly, of a lot of the good that can come out of what a newspaper, what they do, and in terms of serving the public good.
Yeah, I mean, the newspaper industry globally had a downturn beginning with the arrival of the internet, and newspapers, including my own, did not adapt quick enough to having a website. And the Toronto Star was one of the last big newspapers to start charging people a subscription fee to go on our website. And that's because big papers like the Star historically had a lot of display ads. So, and also around the time of the arrival of the internet, then you saw big retailers like Eaton's and others either disappear or severely cut back on their display advertising. And that's where newspapers historically made their money, from the actual ads in the print. And you get less money for an internet ad than you do for a back of the cover Saturday Eaton's ad. And so we're all trying to reinvent ourselves now. We still have the Toronto Star. We still have a very strong print subscription base, but the future is in digital, and we're trying to grow that just the same as the Boston Globe or the New York Times are. I mean, I'm a Pollyanna. I'm a very positive person. I think there will always be newspapers. That maybe just because I hope there will always be newspapers. If we were to let AI write the news, or people on social media fire out what they think the news is, that would be bad for democracy. And I think people generally agree with that concept, but when it comes down to it, people, how can I say this, pay for Netflix and not for news. And so, we're always in the business, and you can tell I've done this on your podcast. I'm trying to get people to subscribe, because if we don't have this other level of scrutiny which comes from the media, from a well-funded, and well-funded means you have good people who know what they're doing and how to really properly investigate something, or just simply report on a council meeting, then we're going to take a step back as society. But it's hard. It's a tough fight, and all sorts of industries are going through this right now. It's not just us.
Well, look, the comparable I like to draw a little bit is the music industry. The music industry will, we used to all buy CDs and tapes and whatever. And then with Napster, and then, it turned on its head, right? And there was big pushback at the time. And now the way that we consume music is totally different. And hopefully that, that same sort of transformation happens with newspapers where, yeah, it's going to change. But again, the importance of having people like you and having budgets and money to spend to investigate something properly is pretty damn important, because somebody just tweeting something out on Twitter or putting something out there in the space and not actually vetting it the way that you would do that at the Toronto Star, that is dangerous. And that's what I'd say is that if you go through and you've done 3 major things apart, and as well as a whole bunch of articles on this. If you can appreciate nothing else, appreciate the level of detail and thoroughness that goes through in terms of coming up, because again, you need a level of budget and time and effort in order to do that. And one tweet on something is not a replacement for that.
Yeah. And so, we're governed by the law of libel and slander. And so if we were to write something and somebody took issue with it, they're going to sue us. What's fascinating to me is if you were to look on Twitter, X as it's now called, or other platforms, you'll see a lot of tweets that are quite libelous and I mean very damaging to somebody's reputation. And in this country, there has not been a user sued yet. There was a case in England some years ago, but it hasn't happened here yet. And once that does happen, and there will be a case where somebody goes really too far and says something about somebody, and that will, I think, rein in the social media armchair journalists. That hasn't happened yet. And I mean, social media is it. There's a wonderful thing about it, but there's also some really horrible things about it. And we can't. I mean, I have stories that I would like to get in the paper, and my editors are quite rightly saying, "You're not there yet, Kevin." Yep. But there's nobody sitting beside somebody on X saying, "Oh, you're not there yet. Don't send that tweet."
Well, look, it's the proverbial you can't unring the bell, and once it is out there, you can't delete it. And that's why I'd say the work that you do, the stakes are quite high. Now you drew a comparable to doctors and things like that, which is true. What you do is not heart surgery, but again, on the flip side, if you're ever wrong, it would have consequences for people and their families and their reputations and things like that. And again, I'm sure one of the questions I have for you is that when you send over that story at whatever your cutoff date is, and you go to sleep at night, and you can probably hear the papers printing in your head type of thing, like what is going through your head, saying, God, there must be some amount of self-doubt to say, God, I've done everything I can, but I could have done this, or you know what I mean? Like, what is going through your head at that point? Or are you saying, you know what? I'm going to sleep. I've done this for 39 years. I'm going to sleep soundly. I have done everything I possibly can.
Yeah, the latter. At that point, we have so many different checks and balances, starting with my own. I'm very critical of my own work, and have I got something nailed down? So no, I don't. It's an exciting time. It was, back in the old days when it was just a print paper, and we used to be at the foot of Yonge Street in Toronto, and we the presses were actually in our building. It was pretty exciting to go down to the gantry and watch your story come rolling along the crazy print line. Pretty
Absolutely.
cool.
Well, and it's pretty fun. The old newspaper boxes, right, where you used to put in 50 cents and get your newspaper, and to be able to walk Yonge Street and pass X number of boxes to see your story there in the newspaper box would be pretty cool. Yeah, that's a pretty cool thing to be able to do that. So, Kevin, we've talked for 30 minutes and we haven't got into Barry and Honey yet. I'm just going to draw one more analogy for people on Kevin's work on the Barry and Honey Sherman. Now, this is a bit bittersweet because I'm going to use a hockey analogy. Kevin, I don't know if you're a hockey fan, but
I'm a huge fan, and my brain is dominated by what happened to the Leafs. But yeah.
So to make it so they lose on Saturday night in a heartbreaking fashion, and to make it even worse, the Bruins hammer Florida last night 5-1, and
that's a good thing.
Well, but we're thinking
the Bruins to win.
Yeah. But we're thinking to ourselves, if only the Leafs won on Saturday night, maybe that would have been them on Monday night hammering Florida 5-1, and being up and one step closer to the Stanley Cup. But I'm going to use a hockey analogy here because I think it's a perfect comparable when I compare it to your work. Is that back in the 90s, one of the most famous players was Mark Messier. Mark Messier at the time did a series of commercials for Lay's potato chips. And the play in the commercial was something along the lines of, he would make a bet with somebody and he would say, "I'll bet you can't just eat one chip." And sure enough, the person, Mark Messier, would make the bet. The person would have one chip and they couldn't stop. They would eat multiple chips. Mark Messier would win the bet and they would do something crazy as a result of that. Now, again, I have read the book, listened to the podcast, watched the Crave episode, and I would challenge everybody that if you're going to do that, and I would highly recommend to do it, I can pretty much guarantee you that you are not going to be able to either read one chapter, listen to one episode, or watch one Crave episode in a single sitting, because it is highly addictive. Everything is intertwined. It is very, very difficult to put down. So, Kevin, congratulations on all of that great work, because each one of those, as I mentioned earlier, you learn something a little bit different in this very tragic story of Barry and Honey. But maybe just to give people, as a starting point, give people a little bit of background on Barry Sherman. What I love, again, the book goes into a lot of details on some very funny, interesting, quirky stories about the Sherman family, which is just so much fun to read. But maybe just starting with Barry, give us a little bit of perspective on Barry Sherman.
Yeah, so Barry Sherman was born in the 1940s. He was the son of a Toronto businessman who was the president of the American Zipper Company, the Canadian division, made zippers for pants. And they had a good middle class life, lived in Forest Hill in Toronto. And Barry's father died when Barry was 10. And his mother, who had not been working, went back to work as an occupational therapist, took in boarders. Barry, who is a brilliant guy, was a terrible student in elementary school and the early part of high school. He was called butterball and sluggish by his teachers. Teachers could, I guess, said things like that in those days and got away with it. And something clicked with him when he got to his final year of high school, and he ended up getting. He was a top student in Ontario by far, and he went on to University of Toronto, and then he went to MIT in the U.S., did a PhD and a master's in very few number of years, and he was going to be a rocket scientist. I can't remember the title, but it was something to do with satellites was his final PhD thesis. And he was going to go work at NASA. But then his uncle, who was a pioneer in the generic drug field, died. early, just like Barry's dad. And Barry went back to Toronto, and with his best friend from high school, bought the company. Ended up selling it, turning it around, selling it. And this is a time in the 60s when generics were not what they are today. There were just a few products. But government health programs and private insurance companies were thinking, this is pretty good. We can get these cheaper drugs. It'll cut costs for us. And then Barry spins that into Apotex, and which went on to be and is today the biggest generic company in Canada, the biggest pharmaceutical company in Canada. And we don't have a lot of big companies doing pharmaceuticals in Canada anymore. And, he was a millionaire in his 30s, a billionaire in his early 50s. And in the 1970s, he met Honey Sherman, Honey Reich. That was her maiden name. And she had a very different upbringing. She was a child of the Holocaust. Her parents were in a slave camp, survived the Holocaust, and ended up meeting each other. And Honey was born in a displaced persons camp in Europe, and then the whole family came to Toronto. She became a elementary school teacher. Met Barry through friend of a friend. This is before Hinge and any dating profiles. You just met somebody, a friend introduced you, and they got together and both had a real love of philanthropy. And when Barry started making any money at all, he and Honey got involved in charity and gave out a lot of millions of dollars eventually. But Barry's a workaholic. He's a penny pincher. He had a series of old ragtop convertibles. He loved convertibles. His executive assistant told me that the car that he had at the time of his death, she had driven it just a few months before to pick up Swiss Chalet chicken because that was his favorite lunch. And she said her foot went practically to the floor because there were no brakes. And I mean, how would a billionaire afford a brake job or a new car? And that's just the way he was. And Honey, there's so many stories of Honey. She would darn her workout shorts. She had the same pair of workout shorts for 20 years, and she got a hole in the crotch. She would sew it up herself, but she'd also go to Florida and buy 10 high-end purses and just stuff them into a closet. They were real. There's a lot of contradictions in the Shermans. Honey was very sharp-tongued. She was tough on wait staff. She was real fundraiser, and her friends would hate it when they'd be with her at an event, and then she'd be looking beyond them to the person who was going to be her target to give $1 million for the latest campaign. So yeah, they're really interesting people. There's a lot of people out there who've said things in the media that they're not nice people. I've had the benefit through my work of getting to know a lot of their quite close friends, and I'm still in touch with them. I had dinner the other night with Barry's best friend. I always keep in touch with these people, and so I'm getting from them these nice stories, and I do know there's another side to them. But anyways, interesting people. I find them endlessly fascinating.
And the last thing you think about when you read your book is that you wouldn't want to spend time with them, because I read your book and I think, man, I wish I had the opportunity to work with someone like Barry, who has his sense of humor, and even Honey, her sense of humor that you articulate in the book, Kevin, is there's the story when she hops on that horse whose name is Adolf. Like, what a great line. I'm not even going to give it away. You got to read the book in order to get the one-liner. But man, what a great one-liner that she had when she hops on that.
Yeah,
when she hops on that horse.
Out. That's a great one-liner.
And they're just people that you would just want to be around and associate yourself with. And you look at how charitable they are, or they were. And again, the story in your book of him getting a call from somebody, when he's just starting out, about trying to fix the broken bus. I'll give you the money, but just don't tell anybody I gave it to you. You know what I mean? Like they just seem like really good people. I think one thing to touch a little bit on is the kids as well. Is they had 4 kids. Not surprisingly, Barry, if you're going to be a billionaire, you're probably going to have to work for it, as Barry did, especially when you come from nothing, like what Barry did. He worked his way up. Maybe just give some perspective on the 4 kids and the relationships that the kids had with the parents.
Yeah, I mean, it was not a happy home. There are 4 children. The eldest daughter, Lauren, was the only one that was a natural childbirth. The other 3 were surrogacies, and they parented in different ways. Barry parented by giving money to the kids, millions of dollars, and more to some, more to the older 2 than to the younger 2. Honey didn't like that, and she was very, very tough on the kids, would be quite mean to them. And they did have family dinners, but there was usually a lot of tumult, if I can put it that way. A lot of arguments, and Honey would say something. Barry was actually very quiet in these settings, but Honey would say something sharp to one of the kids or one of their partners, and it would go downhill from there. So Lauren is the eldest, and then there's Jonathan, who's the only son of and with 3 sisters, and Jonathan was the only one interested in business. He was funded by what I dubbed in my series the Bank of Barry. Most people around them were funded by the Bank of Barry. There's no, very few people in their orbit who are using conventional banks to fund their enterprises. And Jonathan went to did civil engineering in Columbia in the U.S. and claimed to his father in numerous emails to know a lot about business, and perhaps even more than his father, and would criticize what Barry was doing with the money. And Jonathan, the son, started his own storage business, like a personal storage business. And they had a lot of the discourse back and forth and the emails I've seen. It's pretty nasty stuff. And then there's the 2 younger daughters, Alexandra, who's the one interested in continuing on the charity legacy of her parents, and then Kaylin, who's quite young. She's in her 20s, late 20s. And what happened in this over the last 6 years is that the sister Alexandra has accused her brother Jonathan of having something to do with the murders. And that does not make for great family get-togethers, as you can imagine. So Jonathan, as far as I know, is kind of on a bit of an island right now in the family, and the 3 sisters are allied together. And the one sister, Alexandra, has given her theories to the police, and the police are investigating. I've spoken to Jonathan. I've asked him about all this. He said categorically, I have nothing to do with the death of my parents. I love my parents, and it was just one of the many things that the police have had to check out.
So take us to December 13th, 2017. Barry and Honey are found dead shortly thereafter. Take us through how this was initially reported to the public. What was the initial cause of death, and how was it first reported in the newspapers when Barry and Honey were first found? But again,
it's an interesting. Yeah, so December 13th, as far as I can tell, by 9 p.m. that evening, that they've both been murdered and put in the swimming pool room in the basement of the Sherman's 12,000 square foot house, and it's not for 36 hours till the bodies are discovered. And so the first news to the public came out by actually the health minister of Ontario at the time, who knew Barry, and think it's about 3:30 p.m. on the Friday, December 15th, that he tweets out, sad news that Barry and Honey Sherman passed away. And quite quickly, and that afternoon and evening, there's nothing in the media, but the family, the kids are getting a sense that police believe this is a murder-suicide. And this is detailed in the book and the documentary, but Joe Warmington, who's a great guy at the Toronto Sun, Joe, great reporter, he says that he was about that evening to file a story for the Saturday paper saying that they were executed. That was going to be his lead, top line of the story. And he gets a call from a police source. Joe knows who that source is. I don't. Who said, no, we're looking at murder-suicide, that Barry killed Honey and then took his own life. And so this is a shock to Warmington, because he's talked to people at the crime scene, and it's quite different. So he, on the front page on Saturday, the day after the bodies are discovered, reports that it's police are looking at a murder-suicide. And then I'm not involved this time at all, but my paper, the CBC, the Globe and Mail, everybody reaches out to their police sources, and I don't know who any of these people are. And by later that Saturday, and certainly into Sunday, all the media, my newspaper and everybody else, is reporting the same thing. Police sources say they're looking into murder-suicide. And I don't get involved for 3 weeks, and I'm assigned to find out if it's murder-suicide or double murder. And so that's how I got involved. But yeah, it was interesting. And I have looked back at all of the reporting in that first 3 weeks, and this is a big story, and it was an international story because they're very wealthy and very well known, and they're found in such an odd positioning in their house that it attracted a lot of attention. And then this murder-suicide theory, which everybody who knew the Sherman said was crazy. It was a crazy idea, but it really had legs.
Well, and the one thing that confused me is why would the Toronto police say anything? Why don't they just say no comment and just leave it at that, and just say, look, I don't want anything to get out there. Let's just wait, and let's just finish our investigation and conclude, and the facts will take us to the facts, as opposed to information leaking out and people again building stories off of it. It goes back to what we had talked about earlier, is trying to decipher fact from fiction, which I can imagine is incredibly is difficult. Now in this case here, I don't think it was fiction, because again, that is what they were looking at. But I'm just surprised that the police would say anything, is that they would just shut it down and just say, you know what, let's wait till we finish, and then we'll officially comment.
Yeah, I take your point, but I mean, I don't know who these police sources are, but I do know, when I read Joe's story, and I don't know Joe that well, but I do know he has really good sources, and he's a good reporter. He's a columnist, but he is a reporter. And so when I read it was Joe, I thought, okay, well, this is what the police are saying. I eventually came to understand that Joe had been misled. I don't fault Joe for that at all. In fact, I think it's really important, because one day if there is a charge and all of the information is aired in a courtroom, we will get a sense of what caused Canada's biggest police agency to make the wrong decision. And part of it is because the pathologist, who himself doesn't have the greatest, but he had another case that he had misidentified something as not being murder. The pathologist and the cops, it was kind of a perfect storm where neither one of them wanted to say this is obviously double murder. I have seen the crime scene photos and the autopsy information from the early autopsy, and to me it's crazy that these two different agencies, the pathologist and the police, made this mistake. And And so how I was convinced to get involved in this, because I used to cover murders, but I don't anymore, is that we need to be better. Like our forensic people and our policing people need to be better. They cannot make mistakes like this, because if they're making mistakes on something as high profile as this, what's happening in all the other cases where we don't even hear about them?
Yeah. Well, again, you go back to how we started this conversation. Jobs where the stakes are through the stratosphere. We talked about your job. You talked about lawyers. You talked about doctors. Police officers would be right up there on that list. What they do is critically important for the public good. And everybody makes mistakes. Again, nobody is going to bat 1,000, but man, the importance of learning and trying to get better. And like, again, the stakes on what they do, I can just imagine, like even trying to describe, Kevin, you talk a lot about the first 48 hours of an investigation, how critical that is. Like what goes on in those first 48 hours? I can just imagine the process in which not a lot of time to kind of figure things out.
Yeah. So I've, I spent the last 6.5 years arguing in court to successfully in 50% of the documents, getting things unsealed. And I can see that the question the police were asking in the first 5 weeks really was not who would have done this, but why would Barry do this? And so, the police are looking for a suicide note. It's unfortunate that they were not spending more investigative resources, and they have lots of investigative resources. They weren't spending more resources looking for suspects. And that, of course, gives suspects a time to get away. I wanted just to circle back to something. I didn't answer it correctly, or I didn't give you the answer you were looking for. And that is not that you were looking for an answer, but you asked me, why would the police say anything? And there's thousands of people in the Toronto Police Service. I don't know at what level this information came out.
Yep.
I don't think this was from the homicide squad, the source. I think the source, it could have been public relations, one of the officers who works in public relations. It could have been a divisional person, and division being, as homicide is a special squad in a police agency, and then there's the division people who respond. That's my feeling, that it's somebody like that who was talking out of school. But I'm glad they did, because had they not done that, that story wouldn't have come out, and I would not have been assigned to this, and the case never would have become a double murder investigation. Or
that's a great point, Kevin. I didn't think about that. Is that if it didn't come out and you didn't, now I know we're trying to rewrite history, which you can't do, but it's still fun to try. How do you think it would have played out if you didn't get involved?
This is interesting, because the December 15th is when the bodies are found. I'm assigned on January 6th, and through contacts I had, I was able to get access to the Sherman family's private pathology results. So they got another pathologist, a more experienced pathologist, to do a second set of autopsies. Those autopsies were done in 6 weeks after the bodies were found. We're still in December. I've never gotten a straight answer from the Shermans. Why didn't they have a press conference and say, our pathologist says this is double murder? I ended up through sources, and the sources weren't the Sherman family, I can tell you that right now. From other sources, I find out that the second set of autopsies is done, and a veteran pathologist has determined it's double murder. That's all I did, is I found out about their second investigation, and I put it on the front page. And that caused the chief of police at the time, Mark Saunders, to ask homicide, hey, did you talk to this other pathologist who was in the provincial autopsy suite working on what are basically legally the police's bodies, like their evidence? It's still their evidence. And so then the homicide says, no, we didn't attend that second autopsy. And Saunders, as I'm told, says, you guys are crazy. Go talk to the second pathologist, get his report, because it's on the front page of the Star. And then they have a press conference a couple of days later announcing that it was a double murder. And so had I or somebody like me not been involved, I think it would have gone nowhere, because there didn't, for some reason, there's this disconnect where the Sherman family was not handing information to the police. And I find that really odd, and I still don't know why they sat on that. I would have, if I was them, and families do this all the time, they have a press conference. They had Brian Greenspan, who is, one of the top criminal lawyers representing them. He could certainly have had a press conference.
Yeah, again, we talk a little bit about the beginning about the role of investigative reporters such as yourself, the role of newspapers in getting to the bottom of the truth. And again, there is no better example than this. So it's a double murder that, it sounds like, has been that is fact as it stands now. Kevin, you talk a lot about in your book about, what you believe it was the sequence of events. Obviously, we don't know who did it. I'm sure you have your theories, but we don't know who did it. What's your take on how this all went down in terms of how this happened? Has anything changed between your book or the podcast or anything in terms of the sequence of events on those days and how you think this all went down on that particular day?
Well, I think that, of all of the information, other than information in my stories, the most current would be the podcast. And I think it was a two-person job. I think that the people who did it were the people that wanted it done, as opposed to hiring some killer from a Jason Bourne movie. I say that because they were strangled, and strangulation is a very personal crime. I think that they got very lucky because they didn't get the A team, the homicide squad that day. Very lucky. And I think the people who did it had knowledge of Barry and Honey's movements, probably through access to their, Honey had no password on any of her devices. She had many devices, iPads and cell phone and computer, no passwords, and Barry's was 1, 2, 3, 4. And the day that they were lying there, the Thursday in between the murders and the day they were discovered, was the rare day when there was nobody coming into the Sherman house. Honey had given her a longtime assistant a few days off to prepare for a trip down south. Barry's, best work friend, Jack Kay, because of something Honey had arranged in the summer, was away in New York at a concert. They worked side by side for 35 years, and Jack Kay was the guy who's down in New York. If he'd been there, he would have wondered where the heck Barry was, and he would have sent somebody or gone himself to their house. And they didn't have anything scheduled. The Sherman house was for sale. There's all sorts of showings booked. There was cleaners coming in constantly, personal trainers that Honey would arrange for herself and for Barry. There was just nothing on that day. And I think that's key. I think the time is really important in a murder investigation. And so one of the things that I'm sure the police are trying to figure out is who knew about their whereabouts.
I'm going to share my perspective, and I would just love to get your reaction. So I read through all the, again, as I mentioned, I read the book, watched the Crave series, listened to the podcast, and again, I was an avid follower of watching reading the newspapers at the time. And I come to my own perspective that this was something out of a Jason Bourne movie, because to think that somebody could two, let's say amateurs, people who haven't done this before, to think that they could pull this off. And the one thing about the murder scene, it would seem to be relatively tidy. Like, it's not like, the house was a disaster with broken windows, and it seemed to be very, very clean. They staged it, and they were able to fool certain people that this was a suicide, which again would take some amount of effort in order to do that. And they were able to get out without even a whisper of, I'm sure the police have suspects, but we're sitting here X number of years later, and nobody's been held accountable for what's happened. To think that an amateur could actually pull all of that off is actually, to some degree, quite terrifying. That somebody could, could do that. And that's why I struggle with saying that this was somebody who wasn't a professional, because I don't know how a non-professional could actually pull it off like that way. What's your take on that, Kevin? Because when I went through everything, that was kind of what I was thinking. You know what I mean? That it would be hard to pull that off, and that's your first time you've ever done, and your brain is in fight or flight mode, right? Like, you are, if you're doing that for the first time, you are not thinking straight. You are not thinking, I need to get out of this house, I need to go it. Again, to think that a non-professional could pull that off is stunning in my mind. But what's your 2 cents on that, Kevin?
Well, the reason I don't think it's a professional is, from my understanding from people in law enforcement that I talked to over the years, professionals don't do it in the person's house. And that's just too risky. It's too risky. Barry himself said, an example of his gallows humor in a book about the pharmaceutical industry, he knows he's got enemies. They'll just shoot him coming out of the office at 10 o'clock at night. And they would just shoot him. They're not going to kill his wife. That doesn't make any sense. And how can a human being kill another human being? The reality is it happens, as awful as it is. And I don't know. I couldn't do it, but there are people out there who do commit crimes. And it's a very personal crime, and one would think, to strangle somebody, it's not an easy thing to do. From Barry and Honey's friends, and they love Barry and Honey, but they do talk about the macabre details of this, and they say, Honey would have fought like hell. She was 7 years old, but she was really tough. Barry was a pussycat. He wouldn't have fought it. So, there's the element of surprise that killers would have. I could be wrong. Like, we'll see.
It's the other thing you really get from reading the book, especially when you get into the later chapters, is actually thinking about that evening when they would have come home. That is terrifying, to think that, that's what's waiting for you when you get home that day. And that, Honey, racing into the bathroom and dropping her phone. And it's terrifying to think that something like that could happen. And that's the other thing that really jumps off the pages of the book. And Kevin, I've heard you say this recently, in terms of where the investigation stands now. Is the will still the main point of focus, where something relating to the will, or is it kind of, because it seems to be quiet, and I just know what I read about in the papers. I read it, there's normally like an annual update, around the December timeframe when they touch. Maybe there's a little bit more than that, but it's been pretty quiet on the front, right?
The quiet is because I haven't written anything. Nobody else is writing about it, and I'm working on another series. So sometime in the next month or so, there will be other stories that I have uncovered related to this. The thing is, when you do a Sherman story, then there's a lot of stuff comes in. So I have to, it's not like just a one-off thing. I've got to kind of have free time to chase down these other phone calls that I know I'm going to get. The police sometimes they'll do a press conference in December. That last year there was a press, the sister put out Alexandra said that she wanted to remind people that her, the 10 million from the family is still out there. And then soon after that, Jonathan told one media outlet, I want to add another 25 million to that. So now it's a $35 million reward. Police are not in the habit of providing any information through my efforts in court. I'm not a lawyer, but every 6 or so months, go to court to argue for more unsealing of police documents. And I'm in that process right now in this month, where I've been cross-examining the lone full-time detective, and he maintains that it is still an active investigation. They have not done a search warrant on anything for since I think 2022. That's the last one. They were looking for some various financial records and got them. They've been looking overseas in 5 different countries for information. They don't reveal what it is. That's part of the information that's sealed. And, they still believe that the walking man, this person caught on a video camera in the area that night, is a suspect, one of the suspects. I suspect he's probably was a lookout, maybe. And, they're still investigating. I believe the police have, I know the police have a theory of this case that they are trying to prove, and they have not been able to do it. And so it's one thing to have a theory, a person of interest. It's quite another to have a suspect that you can arrest, because the police don't want to get to court and have the case thrown out. They probably figure they got one shot at this. And as long as it's taken 6.5 years so far, there are other cases that I know of that have taken longer, 10 years. It happens, right? And there's no DNA or there's no forensic information that is helpful to them, apparently.
Yeah, well, the house is gone, right? Like that's
no. But at the time, they didn't find any. Yeah. They didn't find anything that there's, as you can imagine, lots of fingerprints and hair and stuff like that from members of the Sherman family, their friends, realtors, agents. There's lots of stuff like that, but none of that helped them with the case.
And if you were a betting person, do you think this is ever solved in your, in the next,
I'm not a betting person, but I think there will be a resolution to it, and I'm committed to seeing it through. But I'm not getting any sense that it's an imminent resolution.
Last question. You've done a lot of materials on this. On the Barry and Honey situation. Anything more we can look forward to? I think the one thing that's missing is, almost a little series on the Barry and Honey story, like with actors and things like that. I think that would be, because, I think especially as Canadians, when you read the book, learning about Barry and Honey, it's almost a must read. Like, it's just you're so much better off when you read the book and you learn about them and all the good that they did and the building of, Apotex and everything like that. And they took your book and the podcast and the series, they could make a pretty cool docuseries on the whole thing.
That's well, so we did a documentary and sometime down the line there will be what would be called a scripted one with actors, but not until there's a resolution. I don't see that. But yeah, and so there will be for your listeners, your podcast sometime in the next, I would say, month and a bit. There will be a series of stories in the Star that they can watch or read, right. I should say.
Well, Kevin, thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Again, I would highly suggest that everybody take a watch, read, and a listen to the Billionaire Murders. It is a fascinating story, and it is a true story. That is the other thing, people. This is not fiction. This is true. And it is, when you read through it, there's so many emotions. Again, learning about Barry and Honey, And again, trying to play in your mind the events of those days is just terrifying. And again, to think that that could happen, and we still don't have an answer on who did it, so many years later is concerning. It is. And Kevin, I thank you for all of the work that you've done trying to get to the truth, because there's a lot of stories in there too where you're spending your own time in courtrooms and things like that, trying to unseal information in order to get to the bottom. And it is a long, and I can imagine, stressful, process with a ton of work in order to get there. And again, I can just I envision you in that courtroom. You're sitting there by yourself, and I'm guessing, there's a team of lawyers on the other side, and you're not a lawyer. You know what I mean? Like, you're sitting there by yourself trying to figure all this stuff out, trying to just get to the truth. And again, you should be really commended for that. And I think, again, as Canadians, we owe you a big thank you to try and
thank you
in your efforts trying to get to the bottom of this. Yeah. Great.